The year of our Lord 1887 had baked the high plains of Wyoming Territory to the color of a cracked brick for 3 days. The stagecoach had been Eliza Kane's world, a cramped, sweat-soaked box of jolting wood and worn leather, its rhythm dictated by the plodding gait of 4 tired horses. Outside, an endless sea of sagebrush and grama grass rolled away to a horizon that never seemed to get any closer. The sky was a vast, terrifying blue, so immense it made a person feel like an ant crawling across a dinner plate. Red dust, fine as flour, seeped through every crack and seam, coating Eliza's tongue, settling in the creases of her traveling dress, and turning the black bombazine to a dull, weary brown. Beside her, 6-year-old Rosie slept, her small head resting in the crook of Eliza's arm. A damp curl of corn silk hair was stuck to her cheek, and her breath was a soft, steady puff against her mother's side. Eliza tightened her grip, a fierce, protective motion. Every lurch of the wheels on the rutted track was a reminder of the gamble she had taken, a wager made with the last of her dignity and a handful of carefully worded letters. Hope and shame were bitter companions, churning in her stomach with every mile that carried them further from the familiar grime of Boston and deeper into this raw, untamed land. She had answered the advertisement in the Matrimonial Times with the desperation of a drowning woman reaching for a piece of driftwood. Jack Malloy, a horse rancher in a place called Bitter Creek. His letters were short, spelled out in a strong, clear hand that suggested little formal education but a great deal of purpose. He wrote of needing a wife, a partner to build a life with. He made no mention of poetry or romance, only of shared work, mutual respect, and the honest solitude of his Lone Butte ranch. He had sent a photograph, a tall, solemn man with broad shoulders and steady eyes, standing before a simple log cabin. He looked like the mountains that rose in the distance behind him, solid and unyielding. Eliza had written back, carefully constructing a version of herself she thought he would want. A widow, yes. Hard-working, certainly. Of good character, absolutely. She had enclosed her own photograph, one taken 5 years ago, before grief and fear had carved fine lines around her eyes, and she had omitted the most important fact of her existence. She had not mentioned Rosie. It was a lie of omission, a sin of silence she had justified 1,000 times on the long train ride west. And every day since in this rattling coach, how could she explain? How could she put into words the suffocating dread of raising a daughter alone in a city that offered nothing but low wages and the constant, leering threat of men who saw a widow as fair game? She had needed a way out, an escape hatch for her child. Jack Malloy and his ranch in the empty heart of the continent were that hatch. But the hope of a safe harbor was poisoned by the shame of her deceit. He was expecting a wife. He was not expecting a child. The driver's call from up top broke through her anxious thoughts. Bitter Creek, 10 minutes out. Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs. She gently shook Rosie awake. "Rosie, darling, we are almost there." The little girl blinked, her blue eyes, so like her father's, still clouded with sleep. "Are we going to see the horses, Mama?" "Yes, sweet girl. Soon." Eliza tried to smile, but her lips felt stiff. She smoothed Rosie's dress and tried to tuck the stray hairs back into her braid, her fingers trembling slightly. The coach rumbled over a wooden bridge and the scattered buildings of a town came into view, huddled along a dusty main street as if for protection against the sheer emptiness surrounding them. It was not much. A general store, a saloon with swinging doors, a blacksmith's forge sending up a plume of dark smoke, a livery, and a handful of other unpainted wooden structures. The stage pulled to a halt in a cloud of its own dust in front of a building marked with a sign that read, "Pratt's Mercantile and Post," as the other passengers began to disembark, stiff and grumbling. Eliza scanned the small collection of men gathered on the boardwalk. Her eyes searched for the face from the photograph. And then she saw him. He was taller than she had imagined, standing apart from the others, his stillness a stark contrast to the general bustle. He wore durable denim trousers and a plain cotton shirt, its sleeves rolled up to reveal strong, sun-browned forearms. A low-brimmed hat shadowed his face, but she could see the square set of his jaw and the dark, watchful eyes. He was leaning against a support post, not moving, just waiting. As she stepped down from the coach, holding tightly to Rosie's hand, his gaze found hers. There was no smile, only a quiet, unnerving assessment. Eliza's breath caught in her throat. He was handsome in a severe, weathered way, like a rock formation shaped by wind and time. A thin, silvery scar cut diagonally through his left eyebrow, giving him a permanent look of fierce concentration. This was him. This was Jack Malloy. She led Rosie forward, her legs feeling unsteady. The dust of the street seemed to suck at the soles of her city boots. The townsfolk were watching, their curiosity a palpable force. She could feel their stares, dissecting her worn dress, her pale face, and the small child clinging to her skirts. She stopped a few feet from him. "Mr. Malloy?" she asked, her voice smaller than she intended. He straightened up from the post, his full height making her feel small and fragile. "Mrs. Kane." His voice was a low baritone, calm and even, like the rumble of distant thunder. His eyes flicked from her face down to the little girl at her side, and then back up again. The question was there, unspoken, but as clear as the high, thin air. This was it, the moment the entire world would either crumble or cohere. Eliza swallowed the lump of shame in her throat. "Mr. Malloy," she began again, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "There is something I must confess, something I should have told you in my letters. This is my daughter, Rosie." She braced herself for the anger, the cold dismissal, the public humiliation of being sent back on the next stage east. She saw a flicker of something in his eyes, surprise, perhaps, or something harder to read. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. The curious stares of the onlookers intensified. Jack Malloy held her gaze for a long moment. Then he knelt. He went down on one knee, bringing his face level with Rosie's. The motion was fluid, unexpected. He took off his hat, revealing thick, dark hair lightly dusted with gray at the temples. "Hello there," he said, his deep voice softening. "I am Jack." Rosie, who usually hid behind her mother's skirts in the presence of strangers, simply stared back at him, her expression one of solemn curiosity. She took in the kind lines around his eyes and the fascinating white scar. "My name is Rosie," she said, her own voice a small, clear bell. Jack nodded slowly. "That is a fine name." He looked at the worn rag doll clutched in Rosie's hand. "And who is your friend?" "This is Annabelle," Rosie announced. "She came all the way from Boston." "Well, Annabelle looks like she has had a long journey," Jack said. He then rose to his full height and looked directly at Eliza. The hardness was gone from his eyes, replaced by a quiet understanding that stunned her more than any outburst would have. He placed his hat back on his head. "The child is a part of you," he said, his voice low and meant only for her. "That makes her a part of me." Tears pricked Eliza's eyes, hot and sudden. It was not a declaration of love, not a passionate welcome. It was something far more precious. It was acceptance. A simple, profound statement of fact that felt like the ground solidifying beneath her feet for the first time in years. She could only nod, incapable of speech. "My wagon is over here," he said, gesturing with his head. "Silas is loading your trunk." He took Rosie's small hand in his large, calloused one. "Come on, Rosie, let us go home." As they walked toward a sturdy buckboard wagon, where an older, grizzled man was wrestling her trunk into the back, the whispers started. Eliza could not make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was the sound of gossip, sharp and speculative. She saw women lean their heads together, their eyes following her. A stout woman in an apron, standing in the doorway of the mercantile, watched them with an expression of pinched disapproval. Eliza lifted her chin. her relief warring with a fresh wave of apprehension. She had cleared one hurdle, a mountain of her own making, but it was clear there were others, not of her own making, waiting for her here in Bitter Creek. The ride to Lone Butte was mostly silent. Jack handled the team with an easy, competent air, his attention on the trail. Rosie, seemingly content, sat between them, chattering occasionally about a hawk circling overhead or a strange, horned lizard that scurried across their path. Jack would answer her with a quiet, "That is a redtail," or "They call that a horny toad." He offered no platitudes, no probing questions about Eliza's past. His silence was not awkward. It was comfortable, a space she could simply inhabit without the need to perform or explain. The ranch was nestled in a shallow valley, protected on one side by a high, flat-topped butte that gave the place its name, a clear, fast-running creek lined with cottonwoods and willows, cut through the property. The house was just as it had been in the photograph, a sturdy cabin built of pine logs, with a wide front porch and smoke curling from a stone chimney. Several corrals held magnificent horses, their coats shining in the late afternoon sun. It was beautiful, isolated and peaceful. It felt a world away from the prying eyes of the town. This, she thought, could be a home, a real home. The old man, Silas, helped unload her trunk and then tipped his hat. "Welcome to Lone Butte, ma'am." He gave Rosie a wink before ambling off toward the largest of the barns. "I will show you inside," Jack said. The interior of the cabin was simple, clean, and masculine. A large stone fireplace dominated the main room, which served as a kitchen, dining room, and living area. A long wooden table was flanked by benches. The shelves were neatly stocked. It was the home of a man who lived alone, but took pride in his surroundings. "There are 2 bedrooms," he explained, his voice echoing slightly in the quiet house. "This one is mine. That one will be yours and Rosie's." He gestured to a closed door. "It is not Boston, but it is solid." "It is more than I could have hoped for," Eliza said, and she meant it. Later that week, needing a few provisions, Eliza took the wagon into Bitter Creek, leaving Rosie in the capable, grandfatherly care of Silas. The moment she stepped into Pratt's mercantile, she felt the chill. Constance Pratt, the stout woman from her arrival, stood behind the counter, a look of smug piety on her face. "Good morning, Mrs. Kane," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Or is it still Mrs. One is never quite sure with these arrangements?" Eliza's cheeks burned. "Mrs. Kane is correct." She placed her list on the counter. "I need flour, salt, and a pound of coffee beans. Please." As Mrs. Pratt measured out the flour, she kept up a stream of chatter. It must be quite a change from the big city, so quiet out at Lone Butte. Of course, Jack Malloy always was the quiet type, even before his trouble. She paused, letting the word hang in the air. Eliza refused to take the bait. "It is very peaceful," she said evenly. "Peaceful now, perhaps, Mrs." Pratt continued, her small eyes gleaming with malice. "But this town has a long memory. A man does not nearly kill another man and have it forgotten. Even if the other man was a Dalton, that family has influence, and Jack has a temper on him, a dangerous temper. It is what landed him in the territorial prison for 2 years. Eliza felt a cold knot form in her stomach. Prison. Jack had never mentioned prison. He had written only that he had made mistakes in his youth. "He was defending his sister," Eliza said, surprised at the defensive fire in her own voice. It was a detail she had overheard one of the stagecoach passengers mention. "Mrs." Pratt sniffed dismissively. "So they say. All I know is that Baxter Dalton's boy carried the scars for the rest of his short life, and Jack Malloy carried the reputation of a jailbird. A mail-order bride for a man like that. Well, some women are not particular, I suppose." Eliza gathered her purchases, her hands shaking with barely suppressed rage. She paid the woman, her coins clattering on the wooden counter, and walked out without another word. Her back straight. The safety she had felt at Lone Butte suddenly seemed fragile, a thin wall against a hostile world. Jack had accepted her and her child without judgment, but the world, it seemed, was not nearly so forgiving of him. Driving the wagon back toward the ranch, the butte rising like a promise on the horizon, Eliza understood the true shape of her gamble. She had come to Wyoming seeking a safe harbor for her daughter. Jack, she was beginning to realize, needed one just as much. He needed a family, a buffer against the ghosts of his past. But with his reputation and powerful enemies still lingering like a bad smell, their fragile new beginning was threatened from the outside. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she would have to be as strong and steady as the man she had agreed to marry if their shared hope for a home was ever to survive the red dust of Bitter Creek. Life at Lone Butte Ranch was a relentless education in humility. Everything Eliza had known in Boston, from turning a knob to summon gaslight to drawing water from a tap, was useless here. Her primary adversary was the cast-iron cook stove, a squat black beast that either sulked and filled the cabin with acrid smoke or roared with infernal heat, turning biscuits into charcoal bricks. There was an art to its dampers and vents, a language of wood type and airflow she had yet to master, more than once. Jack came in from the corrals to find her on her knees before it, face smudged with soot, weeping with frustration. He would never laugh. He would simply take the poker, make a few quiet adjustments, and soon the scent of baking bread would replace the stench of failure. Her second nemesis was the water pump. It required a frantic, rhythmic jerking of its long iron handle, a full body effort that left her shoulders aching and her hands raw. The water it produced was sweet and cold, a miracle drawn from the earth, but every bucket felt earned with a pound of her own flesh. Then there were the chickens. In particular, a large Rhode Island red hen with eyes like beads of black glass took a personal dislike to her. The creature would lie in wait, launching itself at her skirts with a furious squawk whenever she went to collect the eggs, forcing her into a daily, undignified retreat. While Eliza wrestled with the domestic machinery of her new life, Rosie blossomed. The vast, empty spaces that had initially seemed so intimidating to Eliza were a wonderland for her daughter. She shed her city pallor and her cautious demeanor. Her skin turned a healthy, sun-kissed tan, and her legs grew strong from running everywhere. She trailed after Silas like a devoted puppy, her small face tilted up in rapt attention as he explained the difference between a slipknot and a bowline, or showed her how to groom a horse until its coat shone like polished mahogany. The gruff old man, who had seemed so formidable at first, melted in the little girl's presence. He carved her a whistle from a piece of willow and taught her the names of the prairie flowers. Soon, Rosie could be seen perched on a corral fence, her small hands earnestly trying to mimic Silas's work with a piece of rope, her voice piping up with surprisingly knowledgeable comments about the horses. Jack remained a quiet, steady presence, a man more comfortable with animals than with people, and more at ease with his daughter-to-be than with his bride-to-be. With Rosie, he was endlessly patient. He would lift her onto the saddle of his own steady gelding, leading her on slow circuits of the yard. He showed her a hawk's nest high in a cottonwood tree and explained how the creek flooded in the spring and ran low in the fall. His hands, which seemed so large and capable when mending a fence or calming a spooked colt, were remarkably gentle as he pointed out a tiny wildflower to the child. Eliza watched these moments from the porch or the kitchen window, a warmth spreading through her chest that was entirely separate from the belligerent stove. She was seeing the man he was, not just the man the world said he was. With her, he was more reserved. The space between them was charged with unspoken things. They worked together in a comfortable rhythm, falling into the patterns of a partnership without discussing it. She would hand him a tool, and his fingers would brush against hers, sending a jolt through her arm that was as startling as a spark from the forge. Their eyes would meet for a fraction of a second before he looked away, a muscle tightening in his jaw. He never spoke of his past, Of the prison time, Mrs. Pratt had so gleefully mentioned, and Eliza did not ask. She sensed it was a locked room, and he alone held the key. He slept in his own room, she in hers with Rosie. He was a perfect gentleman, unfailingly polite, yet the distance he maintained felt like a wall of his own careful construction. A trip to Bitter Creek for supplies remained an ordeal. Constance Pratt had appointed herself the town's moral gatekeeper, and she took every opportunity to remind Eliza of her precarious position. "I trust you are settling in," she said one afternoon, her voice loud enough for the two other women in the store to hear. She was weighing out a sack of beans, letting them fall with deliberate slowness. It is a brave woman who travels so far for a man she barely knows, especially a man with his history. One hopes his temper has cooled with age. "Mr. Malloy is a good man," Eliza said, her voice tight. "Oh, I am sure he is, my dear Mrs." Pratt cooed, her smile not reaching her eyes. "But good men can have bad blood. We all remember what happened to his poor sister, May. Such a tragedy. And then Jack, well, he took the law into his own hands. The Daltons are not a family to be crossed, even now." Eliza felt the familiar heat rise in her cheeks. She finished her business quickly, aware of the other women whispering behind their hands as she left. The prejudice was a constant, low-grade fever, a reminder that she and Jack and Rosie were outsiders, a family forged of desperation and necessity, not of local approval. The first shadow of that old trouble fell across them on a bright, clear Tuesday. Eliza had ridden into town with Jack, Rosie having stayed behind with Silas. As they were securing the wagon in front of the mercantile, a man on a handsome bay stallion rode up. He was dressed in expensive, tailored riding clothes that stood out against the dusty backdrop of the town. He was handsome, with dark, neatly trimmed hair and a charming smile, but his eyes were as cold as creek water in winter. He swung down from his horse with an easy grace. "Malloy," he said, his voice smooth and educated. "I heard you had acquired some new stock." His eyes slid over to Eliza, an appreciative but unsettling gleam in their depths. Jack's body went rigid. He moved slightly, placing himself between Eliza and the stranger. "Baxter," he said, his voice flat and hard. "Judd Baxter, at your service." "Ma'am," the man said, tipping his fine hat to Eliza. He ignored Jack completely. "Welcome to Bitter Creek. I own the Double Bar Ranch, just north of here. We are neighbors, of a sort." "This is Mrs. Kane," Jack said, his tone leaving no room for conversation. "Of course," Baxter said, his smile widening. "The talk of the town. It is not every day we get a lady of quality from Boston. You must find our little corner of the world quite rustic." His gaze drifted past them, toward the valley where Lone Butte lay. He squinted into the sun. "That is a fine stream you have running through your property. Malloy. A man with that much water is a king in this territory, especially with the summer coming on dry. A man would do a great deal to protect such an asset." The words were casual, but the meaning was as sharp as a knife's edge. He was not just looking at the land. He was assessing it, coveting it. Then he turned his cold eyes back to Jack. "I see you are still here. I often wondered what became of you. Just as I sometimes wonder what might have become of your pretty little sister, May, if she had been more sensible. Such a shame." The air crackled. Eliza saw Jack's hands clench into fists at his sides. The scar on his brow seemed to darken. The calm, steady man she knew vanished, replaced by a stranger with a dangerous light in his eyes. She could feel the violence coiling inside him, a beast straining at its leash. For a terrifying second, she thought he would launch himself at Judd Baxter right there in the middle of the street. "Jack," she said, her voice low but urgent. She laid a hand on his forearm. His muscles were like bands of steel. "Let us go." He did not look at her. His eyes locked on Baxter, but he took a deep, shuddering breath. The tension in his shoulders eased by a fraction. Baxter chuckled, a low, unpleasant sound. "It seems your bride has a calming influence. You would do well to listen to her." He tipped his hat again. "Ma'am," with another cold smile. He mounted his horse and rode away, leaving a trail of dust and silent menace. The ride back to the ranch was thick with a tension that was different from the gentle awkwardness that usually defined their silence. This was heavy, fraught with the ghosts of the past. Jack's hands were tight on the reins, his jaw set like granite. That evening, after Rosie was asleep, Eliza found him on the porch. He was staring out into the darkness, toward the sound of the creek that Judd Baxter had so admired. He looked isolated, trapped by his own history. The wall around him seemed higher and thicker than ever. She came and stood beside him, not touching, but close enough for him to know she was there. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the crickets and the gentle murmur of the water. "He is the cousin of the man you—" she started, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes," he said, his voice rough. "His cousin." She finally understood. It was not anger or a lack of feeling that kept him from her. It was this guilt, this terrible weight he carried for what he had done to protect his sister, an act of violence that had cost him his freedom and branded him forever. He was afraid of that part of himself, the part that Judd Baxter had so easily and cruelly goaded. He was keeping his distance to protect her, to protect this fragile new family from the darkness he believed he carried inside him. Looking at his rigid silhouette against the starry sky, Eliza felt a surge of fierce, unwavering resolve. She had not come all this way, endured the dust and the humiliation and the belligerent chickens, to be defeated by the shadows of the past, his or hers. She had fled a life defined by fear, and she would not let it take root here. "We will not let him break this, Jack," she said softly. He turned his head to look at her, his face unreadable in the dim light from the cabin window. "This is our home now," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "He does not get to spoil it. His family does not get to spoil it. That past is not our present." She did not know if her words had reached him across the chasm of his guilt. He did not reply, but as she stood beside him in the cool night air, she made a silent vow. She would not let the ghosts of Baxter or Dalton or Boston win. She would stand with this quiet, wounded man. This was her choice. This was her family, and she would fight for it. Judd Baxter's visit left a poison in the air, a stillness that was worse than any open argument. The first real sign of trouble came 3 nights later. Jack was the one who found it at dawn. A section of barbed wire fence in the north pasture had been cut, the strands snipped clean through with wire cutters. 3 of their best mares had been let out, and it took Jack and Silas half the morning to track them down and herd them back, thankfully unharmed, while they were gone. Eliza discovered the second act of malice. The wooden trough that fed water from the creek into the main corral had been blocked upstream with a crude dam of rocks and mud, turning the life-giving flow into a stagnant puddle. The work was easily undone. A few hours of labor to repair the fence and clear the stream, but the message was clear. It was an inconvenience, not a disaster. It was a test, a pulling at the edges of their piece to see how they would unravel. The hoof prints around the cut fence were muddled, but they led north, in the direction of the double bar, when Jack rode into Bitter Creek to report it. Sheriff Morris listened patiently, his hands resting on his ample stomach. He was a man who looked tired by the endless small cruelties of the frontier. He pushed his hat back on his balding head and sighed. "I hear you, Jack," he said, his voice a weary rumble. "And I believe you. But what do you want me to do? Hoof prints heading north are not proof of anything. The whole territory is north of here. I cannot ride up to Judd Baxter's front door and accuse him of mischief because of a few muddy tracks. You know the law. I need a witness. I need something solid. So I am just supposed to let him chip away at me?" Jack's voice was low and tight, the anger a controlled burn beneath the surface. "I am not saying that," the sheriff said carefully. "I am saying be smart. Do not give him what he wants. He is trying to provoke you. He wants you to lose that temper of yours so he can have the law on his side. Do not let him—" The ride home was long and silent. Jack's frustration was a palpable thing, a dark cloud that filled the space around him. Eliza saw it in the hard set of his jaw and the way he held the reins in a white-knuckled grip. She recognized the signs. It was the same simmering rage she had seen in her late husband, Robert, the prelude to a storm of anger. The fear that coiled in her gut was an old, familiar reflex. She had spent years learning how to make herself small, how to placate and soothe, how to navigate a man's fury to avoid becoming its target. But this was different. Jack's anger was not directed at her or at Rosie. It was aimed outward, at Baxter, but it was contained, held in check by a force of will that was almost frightening in its intensity. She realized he was not fighting Judd Baxter. Not yet. He was fighting himself. He was terrified of the man he had been, the man who had reacted with his fists and paid for it with 2 years of his life. Every cut fence, every blocked trough was a match thrown at the kindling of his past, and he was struggling with all his might to keep it from catching fire. And so they each fought their own private wars. Jack fought the ghost of his own violence. Eliza fought the ghost of the violence that had been done to her. They orbited each other in the small cabin, 2 planets held in place by a shared, unspoken gravity of fear. The nights grew tense. The slightest sound from outside, a coyote's howl or the stamp of a restless horse, would bring Jack out of his chair, his hand resting on the stock of the rifle he now kept propped by the door. The weather turned hot and brittle. The sky took on a pale, hazy quality, and the wind began to blow from the south, a steady, relentless gust that carried the fine red dust into everything. It was dust storm weather. Silas sniffed the air one afternoon and squinted at the horizon. "Gonna be a bad one," he announced. "Best get the stock in close." They spent the next hour herding the horses from the far pastures into the main corrals near the barn. Eliza secured the shutters on the cabin and stuffed rags into the cracks around the doors and windows, a futile attempt to keep the invading dust at bay. Rosie, excited by the strange yellow light and the rising moan of the wind, was supposed to be helping, but she was more of a distraction, her small form darting here and there. "Mama, can I go see the new calf?" she asked, her voice nearly lost in the wind. Silas said he was wobbly. "Not now. Rosie, you stay close to the house," Eliza called out, her own voice thin against the gale. The storm hit with the force of a physical blow. The world outside the cabin dissolved into a swirling vortex of red-brown grit. Visibility dropped to a few feet. The wind shrieked around the corners of the log house, and the fine dust began to sift in, forming little drifts on the windowsills and floors. It was like being inside a drum being beaten by a giant. Eliza was lighting the lamps, the flickering flames casting strange, dancing shadows, when a sudden, terrifying realization struck her. Rosie was not in the cabin. "Rosie," she called, her voice sharp with rising panic. She checked their bedroom. Empty. A cold dread, far worse than anything Judd Baxter could inspire, seized her. "Jack!" she screamed. Jack was already moving toward the door, his face a grim mask. She went to the barn to see the calf. "The wolves?" Eliza whispered, her mind flashing to the howls they had heard on previous nights, growing bolder as the summer wore on. He said nothing, simply grabbing his rifle and pulling a bandana up over his nose and mouth. He handed another to Eliza. "Stay here, bar the door behind me." "No," she said, her fear for her daughter overriding everything else. "I am coming with you." He looked at her for a second, saw the iron resolve in her eyes, and gave a curt nod. He handed her a heavy lantern. "Keep it low so you can see the ground." Stepping out onto the porch was like stepping into chaos. The wind tore at their clothes and blasted their faces with stinging particles of sand. The noise was deafening. The barn, only 50 yards away, was an indistinct shape in the swirling gloom. Jack took the lead, one hand on her arm, the other holding his rifle. They moved slowly, heads down, following the faint outline of the path. Halfway there, they heard it, a sound that cut through the howl of the wind. It was the high, terrified bawling of the calf, and beneath it, A lower, more menacing sound. A series of sharp, hungry yips, punctuated by a long, chilling howl. It was close, dangerously close. They broke into a stumbling run. As they neared the smaller calving shed adjacent to the main barn, they could see them. 3 gray shapes, low and spectral in the maelstrom. The wolves. They were circling the small shed, their forms appearing and disappearing in the clouds of dust, and huddled in the open doorway of the shed. A tiny figure in a blue dress was Rosie. She was frozen, her small face a pale oval of terror. Jack did not hesitate. He raised the rifle to his shoulder. The blast was deafening, a flash of orange light in the red murk. It was not aimed at the wolves, but at the ground in front of them. The animals scattered, melting back into the storm as quickly as they had appeared. In that same instant, Eliza ran. She scooped Rosie into her arms, holding her so tightly the little girl grunted in protest. "It is all right, darling. Mama is here. You are safe." She buried her face in Rosie's dusty hair, her body trembling with the aftermath of terror. Jack stood guard, the rifle ready, his eyes scanning the swirling dust until he was satisfied the threat was gone. Then he herded them back toward the house, his hand a firm, protective presence on Eliza's back. Inside, with the door barred against the storm, the 3 of them clung together in the lamplight. Rosie, her brief terror forgotten, was already recounting the adventure, but Eliza could not stop shaking. She had come so close to losing everything. Nature itself had shown its teeth, proving in one terrifying moment that their human squabbles were nothing compared to its raw, impartial power. Later, long after Rosie was asleep, the storm finally broke. The shrieking wind died down, replaced by the steady, gentle drumming of rain on the roof. It was a clean, soothing sound. Eliza sat at the kitchen table, staring into the flame of a lamp. Jack came and sat opposite her, his face streaked with grime, his eyes weary. They sat in silence for a long time, listening to the rain wash the dust from the air. "In Boston," Eliza said softly, her voice barely audible over the rain. "My husband, he had a temper. Like the storm, it would build and build, and there was nothing anyone could do until it broke. I spent years learning to read the signs, trying to stay out of its path. When I saw that look on your face after you spoke with Baxter, I was afraid." Jack looked down at his own hands. Resting on the table, they were large, scarred, capable of both immense gentleness and terrible violence. "When Baxter spoke of my sister," he said, his voice rough with unshed emotion, "all I could think about was what his cousin did. I wanted to hurt him. I wanted to make him pay. And that feeling, it scares me more than anything. Because I know what happens when I let it take over. I lose myself. I lost 2 years of my life in a stone cell because of it. I will not lose this." He looked up, and his gaze met hers across the table. It was the first time he had ever truly let her see the man behind the wall. "I brought Rosie here to be safe," Eliza said, a single tear tracing a clean path through the dust on her cheek. "I ran from a man who used his fists to solve his problems. I cannot live that life again." "I will not ask you to," he said, his voice firm with a conviction that resonated deep within her. "Baxter wants me to be the animal he thinks I am. He will not have his way. He will not have this house. He will not have this family." A sense of profound peace, as clean and welcome as the rain outside, settled over Eliza. The fear was gone, replaced by a quiet strength. They had faced the storm, both the one outside and the ones within themselves, and they had done it together. They had confessed their deepest wounds, not in detail, but in the shared language of survival. She reached across the table and laid her hand over his. His skin was rough, calloused, but his hand was warm. He did not pull away. Instead, his fingers curled slightly, a silent acknowledgement of her touch. On the rain-swept porch of the small log cabin, surrounded by the vast, dark prairie, a promise was made without a single vow being spoken. They would choose this family. Every day, they would choose it, and they would not let the world, or their own ghosts, break it apart. The rain that followed the dust storm washed the world clean. It settled the grit, deepened the green of the sparse grass, and left the air smelling of sagebrush and damp earth. Inside the cabin, it had washed away something, too. The silence that fell between Eliza and Jack was no longer a space of caution and uncertainty. It was a quiet, shared territory of understanding. They moved around each other with a new, unspoken ease, a partnership forged in the face of a common threat and sealed by the confession of old wounds. But outside the sanctuary of Lone Butte, the atmosphere in Bitter Creek grew more divided. The town was splitting into quiet factions. There was a subtle warmth from some quarters. When Eliza went to the blacksmith's forge to have a loose iron rim on the wagon wheel seen to, Thomas, the big, sweat-sheened smithy, refused her payment. He was a man of few words, with arms as thick as fence posts. "No charge, ma'am," he grunted, wiping his hands on a greasy rag. "Jack's a good man with horses, and any man who stands up to a Baxter is a friend of mine." He said it quietly, without looking her in the eye, before turning back to the heat of his forge, the conversation clearly over. Miss Evelyn Reed, the town schoolteacher, a prim woman with intelligent eyes behind spectacles, stopped Eliza on the boardwalk. "Mrs. Kane," she said, her voice clear and precise. "I do hope your little Rosie will be joining my class when she is old enough. It would be a pleasure to have her. We need more good families in this valley." The emphasis on good was unmistakable, a direct contradiction to the whispers that followed Eliza from Constance Pratt's mercantile. These small acts of kindness were islands in a growing sea of hostility. The Baxter influence was a pressure that could be felt everywhere. Men who worked for the Double Bar would fall silent when Jack entered the saloon for a rare drink. At the mercantile, Mrs. Pratt now served Eliza with a chilly, formal correctness that was somehow more insulting than her previous gossiping. And she was the source of a new, insidious rumor that began to spread like a fever. "I heard from a man who knows a man in the territorial office," she would say to a rapt customer, her voice a conspiratorial whisper, "that there is some trouble with the land surveys out Lone Butte way, something about lost tax receipts. It would be a terrible shame if a man were to lose his ranch over a bit of misplaced paperwork." The rumor was a poisoned dart, aimed with precision in a territory where ownership was often a tangled mess of claims, grants, and handshake deals. The threat of a tax lien was a potent weapon. It created uncertainty, undermining Jack's standing more effectively than any cut fence. When Eliza first heard the whisper, a cold fear touched her heart. It was a threat she understood. Bureaucracy and paperwork were the weapons of the powerful, a way to crush a man without ever throwing a punch. The weight of it all began to settle on Jack. Eliza saw it in the evenings, when he would sit by the fire, not speaking, his eyes fixed on the flames, but seeing something far away. She knew he was wrestling with the sheriff's advice to be smart, a command that went against every instinct he had to fight back directly. One night, after Rosie was sound asleep and the cabin was filled with the companionable crackle of the fire, he finally broke his silence. He rose from his chair and went to a small, locked chest in the corner of the room. He returned with a leather-bound book, its pages worn and softened with age. "This was my sister May's," he said, his voice low and rough. He handled the book with a reverence that was deeply moving. "She wrote in it every day. After she was gone, I could not bring myself to read it for a long time. But in prison, I had nothing but time. Her words were all I had." He opened the diary carefully. She knew what Baxter's cousin was like. She wrote about him, about his cruelty, but she also wrote about other things. He paused, his thumb tracing a line of elegant, faded script. "I want you to hear this." He cleared his throat and began to read. May's voice, filtered through Jack's own, was clear and full of a gentle strength. "He thinks to own people with fear," she had written. He believes a hard hand is the only thing the world understands. But I saw a willow tree by the creek today, bent nearly double in the wind. It did not break, it yielded, and when the wind passed, it rose again. There is a strength in softness that men like him will never comprehend. To forgive is not to forget what was done, but to refuse to let it break you. It is a kind of rising again. He stopped reading, his throat thick with emotion. He closed the book. I spent 2 years hating him, hating myself. I thought being hard was the only way to survive. May knew better. I am trying to learn how to be like that willow tree, Eliza, but it is not in my nature. In his quiet confession, Eliza saw the true depth of his struggle. He was not just a man with a temper. He was a man mourning a sister whose wisdom he had only understood after it was too late. He had trusted her with his greatest shame and his most profound regret. It was a gift that demanded one in return. "My husband, Robert," she began, her own voice unsteady at first. He was a well-respected man in Boston, a man of business, to the world. He was charming, but inside our home, he was like a storm. I told you that. What I did not tell you was how the storm broke. It was not always with his hands. It was with his words. The way he could make me feel small, foolish. The way he would break a dish or slam a door. And the silence afterwards was worse than the noise. He would promise to be better. And for a while, he would be. But the storm always came back. She stared into the fire, seeing the past in the flickering flames. The day I decided to leave, he had not laid a hand on me. He had gotten angry about something trivial, a misplaced ledger. He had swept a vase of flowers from the mantelpiece. It shattered on the hearth. Rosie, who was only 4, started to cry, and he looked at her with such coldness and told her to be silent. It was in that moment I saw it. I saw that he would one day look at her the same way he looked at me, that this house was not a safe place for her to grow, and I knew I would do anything, risk anything, to get her away from that. She finally looked at him. His face was a mask of quiet intensity. He was not pitying her. He was understanding her. He was seeing the steel beneath her fear, the same way she saw the gentleness beneath his strength. The next afternoon, the work done for the day, a restless energy hung between them. The confessions of the previous night had changed the air in the cabin, charging it with a new and potent intimacy. "Let us walk," Jack said, his voice quiet. He led her not toward the open plains, but down the gentle slope to the creek, to the very place May had written about in her diary. A grove of willow trees grew along the bank, their long, silvery leaves rustling in the high country breeze. The water gurgled over smooth stones, the only sound in the vast stillness. They walked without speaking, comfortable in the silence, until they stopped beneath the largest of the willows, its branches trailing almost to the surface of the water. Eliza reached out and touched one of the slender, flexible branches. "A strength in softness," she murmured, remembering May's words. She looked up at Jack, at his strong, serious face, at the scar that seemed less a mark of violence now and more a part of his history. The fear she had lived with for so long was a distant echo, but the memory of it, the feeling of being fragile, was still there. She felt a tremor of vulnerability, a fear of this powerful emotion that was growing between them, an emotion that felt bigger and wilder than anything she had ever known. She took a breath, and the words came out in a whisper, raw and honest. "You will break me." It was an admission of everything, of her shattered past, of her carefully rebuilt walls, of the terrifying hope he had awakened in her. A slow smile touched Jack's lips, a rare and beautiful thing that transformed his entire face, crinkling the corners of his eyes. He stepped closer, so close she could feel the heat of his body. He gently cupped her face in his large, calloused hands, his touch surprisingly soft. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers, his breath warm against her skin. "Darlin," he chuckled, the sound a low, reassuring rumble in his chest. "I will just bend you like a willow." It was a promise, a vow. He was not the storm that shatters. He was the earth that holds fast. He would not break her. He would be the strength that allowed her to yield, to be soft, and to rise again. And then he kissed her. It was not a kiss of reckless passion, but of deep, aching tenderness. It was a kiss of acceptance, of homecoming. It was the sealing of two broken hearts, pieces of which they had offered to each other in the firelight, now being fitted together under the sighing willows. The world fell away, leaving only the sound of the creek and the feeling of his hands holding her as if she were the most precious thing on earth. And under the watchful eye of the silent butte, they ceased to be two separate souls bracing against the wind, and became one. The next morning, the cabin felt different. It was filled with a light that had nothing to do with the sun streaming through the windows. As Eliza moved about the kitchen, preparing breakfast, Jack came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. He rested his chin on her shoulder, and she leaned into his embrace, a feeling of rightness settling over her, deep and true. They were no longer a man and a woman bound by a desperate contract. They were a husband and a wife. The threats outside had not vanished. Judd Baxter was still out there. The rumors in town still festered, but something fundamental had shifted. Their foundation, once built on the shaky ground of necessity, was now solid rock. They were a family, forged not of convenience, but of choice, and they were ready to face the wind together. The peace at Lone Butte was a fragile skin stretched over a boiling pot. It broke in the dead of a moonless night. It was the smell that woke Eliza first, a sharp, resinous stench of burning pine that cut through the familiar scent of the cabin. Then came the sound, a low, hungry roar that was not the wind. A hellish orange light flickered against their bedroom window. "Jack," she cried, shaking him awake. He was out of bed in an instant, pulling on his trousers with a swift, practiced motion. He needed no explanation. One look at the demonic glow dancing on the walls told him everything. He grabbed his rifle from its place by the door. "Stay inside. Lock the door behind me." But Eliza was already pulling on her own clothes, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was not a fight she would watch from a window. She ran to Rosie's bedside. The little girl was still asleep, oblivious to the nightmare unfolding outside. Eliza kissed her forehead, then followed Jack out into the night. The sight that met them was apocalyptic. The large hay barn, the structure that represented a year's worth of feed and the heart of the ranch's security, was a raging inferno. Flames leaped 50 feet into the night sky, devouring the dry timbers and illuminating the entire valley in a terrifying, dancing light. Silas was already there, a tiny, silhouetted figure against the blaze, frantically throwing buckets of water from a trough in a futile, desperate gesture. The heat was a physical blow, driving them back. Sparks and burning embers rained down around them. The horses in the nearby corrals screamed in terror, their eyes wide and white in the firelight, crashing against the wooden fences. The breeding stock Jack yelled over the roar, "We have to get them out." There was no thought, only action. While Jack and Silas fought to open the gates of the main corral, leading the panicked herd of mares and geldings out into the open pasture away from the fire, Eliza ran to the smaller paddock where they kept their 2 prize stallions. The gate was open. The paddock was empty. A cold dread, sharper than the fear of the fire, pierced through her. This was not a random act. It was not lightning or a carelessly dropped lantern. This was calculated. The fire was a distraction. The real target had been the future of the ranch, the 2 animals whose bloodlines were worth more than the barn itself. They could do nothing but watch the fire burn. It was a funeral pyre for their sense of safety. By dawn, the barn was a smoking, blackened skeleton. The acrid smell of defeat hung heavy in the air. Jack stood staring at the wreckage, his face streaked with soot, his expression carved from stone. He looked old, beaten. 2 days later, the post rider delivered the final blow. It was not a rumor whispered in the mercantile. It was an official letter, bearing the seal of the Wyoming Territorial Tax Office. The language was cold, formal, and brutal. It spoke of delinquent property taxes, citing a failure to file receipts for the previous year. It demanded payment of $300, an astronomical sum. By the end of the month, failure to pay. The letter concluded, would result in the forfeiture and public auction of the property known as Lone Butte Ranch. Eliza read the letter over Jack's shoulder, her hands trembling. It was the move of a chess master, a bloodless, legal checkmate. Judd Baxter was not just trying to drive them out. He was trying to steal their home from under them with the full backing of the law he had so clearly corrupted. "We paid the taxes," Jack said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "I delivered the payment and got the receipt myself last fall." "But do you have the receipt now?" Eliza asked, already knowing the answer. He shook his head, a muscle jumping in his jaw. "It was in my ledger, in the desk, in the barn." They stared at each other over the crisp, official paper, the enormity of their situation settling upon them. They had been outmaneuvered, trapped in a lie built of paperwork and ash. The confrontation they had been dreading came that afternoon. Judd Baxter did not send a messenger. He came himself, flanked by two of his hard-faced ranch hands. He rode into their yard as if he already owned it, his expensive saddle creaking, a smug, triumphant smile on his face. He stopped his horse a few yards from the porch where Jack and Eliza stood waiting. "Malloy," he said, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "I heard you had some misfortune. A terrible accident, I am sure." His eyes swept over the charred remains of the barn, then settled on Jack. "Get off my land, Baxter," Jack said, his voice quiet but vibrating with contained fury. Baxter's smile widened. He swung down from his horse, his movements casual and arrogant. "Now, is that any way to talk to a neighbor? I just came to offer my condolences, and perhaps my assistance. I understand you have a small financial matter to resolve with the territory. $300 is a lot of money, but I am a generous man. I might be willing to take this troublesome property off your hands, save you the public embarrassment of a foreclosure auction. I would see it burn to the ground before I sold it to you," Jack said. "You already have," Baxter retorted, his eyes glinting with malice. He took a step closer. "You always did have a temper. Jack, quick to anger. It runs in the family, I suppose. Your sister, May, she was a spirited thing, too, had a fire in her. I do appreciate a woman with a bit of fire. She fought, you know, right up to the end." It happened in a blur, the carefully constructed dam of Jack's control. The promise he had made to himself and to Eliza, shattered into a million pieces. A raw, guttural roar tore from his throat, and he launched himself off the porch, his fist connected with Baxter's jaw with a sickening crack of bone on bone. Baxter staggered back, surprise and then a flash of pure, malevolent joy in his eyes. He raised a hand to his already swelling face, a trickle of blood leaking from the corner of his mouth. "Assault," Baxter said, spitting a mouthful of blood onto the dusty ground. "In front of witnesses, Sheriff Morris will be very interested to hear about this. You just lost your ranch, Malloy, and you are going back to prison." Jack lunged for him again, his face a mask of primal rage, but Eliza was there. She threw herself between them, her hands flat against Jack's chest, her small frame straining to hold him back. "No, Jack, do not!" she cried, her voice desperate. "Look at him. This is what he wants. Do not let him drag you down into the mud with him." He struggled against her, his muscles bunched like steel cables, his eyes still locked on Baxter. For a terrible second, she thought his rage would consume them both. But her words, her presence, seemed to penetrate the red haze. He looked down at her terrified but resolute face, and a flicker of sanity returned to his eyes. His body went slack, the fight draining out of him, replaced by a shuddering wave of despair. Baxter laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Listen to your little woman, Malloy." He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. I will be seeing you again very soon." He mounted his horse and, with his men, rode out of the yard, leaving behind a silence thick with ruin. That night, they sat at the kitchen table. The tax noticed a stark white rectangle between them. They had to raise $300 in less than 2 weeks. It was an impossible task. Jack was silent, consumed by his failure. The punch had cost them everything. He had played right into Baxter's hands. "We are not beaten yet," Eliza said, her voice firm, pulling him back from the edge of his despair. She went to their bedroom and returned with a small velvet pouch. She emptied its contents onto the table, a delicate gold locket, a pair of pearl earrings, and a silver brooch her mother had given her. The last tangible pieces of her life in Boston, the last remnants of the woman she had been. "What are you doing?" Jack asked, his voice rough. "I am fighting," she said simply. "This is our home. It is worth more than memories." The next day, they rode into town and sold every last piece to the pawnbroker. He gave them a fair price, his eyes full of a quiet pity. They sold 2 of their best saddle horses, a decision that felt like cutting off a limb. When they counted the money, their hands shaking, the total came to $230. They were still $70 short. Desperation was a cold, hard knot in Eliza's stomach. That night, as a chill wind rattled the window panes, she made a decision. Jack was too proud, too consumed with his own shame, to ask for help, but she was not. After she put Rosie to bed, she slipped out of the cabin, leaving Jack staring into the cold fireplace. She saddled a horse and rode toward the distant lights of Bitter Creek. She went to the only place she knew men would be gathered, the saloon. Pushing through the swinging doors, she was met with a wall of noise and stale air. The room fell silent as every eye turned to her. A woman, alone. In a saloon at night, it was a scandal. She saw men loyal to Baxter snickering at a corner table. "Please," she began, her voice trembling but clear. "I need your help." "Look what we have here," one of the Baxter men called out, his voice slurred with liquor. "Malloy's mail-order bride, out begging. Has the jailbird run out of money?" Laughter rippled through the room. Constance Pratt, who had been speaking with the owner, turned, a look of vindicated triumph on her face. "Some people should know their place," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Humiliation washed over Eliza, hot and sickening. She wanted to turn and run, to flee back to the relative safety of the ranch. She was about to give up when a large figure blocked the doorway. It was Thomas, the blacksmith, his face grim. He walked past her to the bar and slammed a handful of coins down. "This is for Jack Malloy's wife," he said, his voice a low rumble that cut through the silence. "He is a better man than any 10 of you in here." Another voice piped up from the back. "The blacksmith is right. Miss Evelyn Reed, the schoolteacher," stepped forward, her expression fierce. She opened her small reticule and placed a few carefully folded dollar bills on the bar next to Thomas's coins. "This community is not owned by Judd Baxter." A few other men, a freight worker, a small-time rancher who had also been squeezed by Baxter, came forward. They did not have much, $1 here, a few coins there. It was a small, defiant act of rebellion. They collected $30 in total. It was not enough, but it was not nothing. Eliza gathered the money, her heart too full for words. She looked at the small circle of faces, people who had risked Baxter's wrath for a principle, for a neighbor. "Thank you," she whispered. She rode home under a sky full of cold, distant stars, the meager collection of money clutched in her hand. It was a tiny light in an ocean of darkness, but for the first time in days, it was enough to see the path ahead. It was a glimmer of hope. The $30 Eliza brought back from town was a small weight in her hand, but a heavy stone of hope in her heart. They now had $260, 40 short. The deadline was a shadow that grew longer with each passing day. The morning after her desperate ride, an uneasy quiet settled over the ranch. Jack worked with a grim, focused intensity. mending the corral fences that had been damaged in the fire, his movements tight with unspoken anxiety. He had said little about her trip to the saloon, but his eyes, when they met hers, were full of a deep, bruised gratitude. The unexpected visitor arrived mid-morning. He was a young man, barely out of his teens, with a nervous energy and eyes that would not stay still. He rode a scruffy-looking pony and sat his saddle with the slumped posture of a man carrying a heavy burden. Eliza recognized him as one of the cowboys she had seen flanking Judd Baxter in town. He dismounted at a distance, holding the reins of his horse in a white-knuckled grip. "Ma'am," he said, his voice cracking slightly. He kept glancing over his shoulder as if expecting to be followed. Jack had stopped his work and was watching from the corral, his hand resting warily on the handle of his hammer. "Can I help you?" Eliza asked, stepping out onto the porch. "My name is Pete Morrison," the boy said, swallowing hard. I work for Mr. Baxter. Or I did." He took a hesitant step forward and held out a canvas money pouch, the kind used for bank deposits. It was heavy, and it clinked with the sound of many coins. "This is for you." Eliza stared at the pouch, then at his face. She saw not malice, but a profound and desperate shame. "I do not understand." "It is conscience money," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "What Baxter did to you, burning your barn, stealing your horses, trying to steal your land, it is not right. I took his money, and I did his work, and I kept my mouth shut, but I cannot do it any more." His eyes finally met hers, and she saw they were glistening with unshed tears. "The Daltons, before your time here, my sister, Sarah, she was just 16. They cornered her one day. She was never the same after. She just faded, passed on 2 winters ago. I did not do anything then. I was too scared. I am not going to be scared anymore." He thrust the pouch into her hands. "This is more than you need. It is every cent Baxter paid me for the last 6 months. You take it. You save your home." Before she could say a word, he turned, scrambled back onto his pony, and spurred the animal into a gallop, riding away as if the devil himself were on his heels. Eliza stood on the porch, the heavy pouch in her hand, stunned into silence. Jack walked over from the corral, his face a mixture of suspicion and wonder. Together, they went inside and emptied the pouch onto the kitchen table. A cascade of gold and silver coins spilled out, shining in the morning light. They counted it quickly. $90. They had more than enough. They could save the ranch. Relief, so powerful it made her feel weak at the knees, washed over Eliza. She looked at Jack, a joyful, tearful laugh bubbling up in her throat. He was looking at the money, a slow, wondering smile spreading across his face. The first genuine smile she had seen on him in weeks. The sound of approaching horses shattered the moment. They both looked up, their joy instantly turning to alarm. Through the window, they saw Sheriff Morris riding into the yard, followed by 2 deputies. "Jack," Eliza whispered, her hand flying to her throat. Jack's smile vanished. He scooped the money back into the pouch and pressed it into her hands. "Go," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Get Rosie. Go into the bedroom and stay there." He met the sheriff on the porch. Eliza, her heart pounding, did as he said, gathering a bewildered Rosie into her arms and retreating into the back room, leaving the door open just a crack. "Morning, Jack," Sheriff Morris said, his voice carrying clearly into the house. He sounded tired, and for the first time, Eliza heard a note of genuine regret in his tone. "Sheriff," Jack answered, his own voice calm and steady. "I have a warrant for your arrest," the sheriff said. Without preamble, Judd Baxter swore out a complaint. "Assault, there were witnesses. I have to take you in." There was a long silence. Eliza held her breath. "I figured you would be coming," Jack said finally. There was no anger in his voice, only a deep, weary resignation. "All right, let me say goodbye to my wife." He came back into the cabin. He walked not to the bedroom, but to Eliza, who had stepped out, unable to stay hidden. He took her by the shoulders, his grip firm and reassuring. "Listen to me," he said, his eyes boring into hers. "This does not change anything. You take that money, you ride into town, and you pay that tax. Do you understand me? You save this house. That is all that matters." "But Jack, they cannot." "They can—" He cut her off, his voice gentle but firm. "This is how he plays the game, but we are going to beat him. Pete Morrison gave us more than money. Eliza, he gave us a chance. Now you have to take it. Do not worry about me. Just hold on to this place. Hold on to it for Rosie. For us." He bent down and kissed her. A hard, quick kiss, full of love and desperation. Then he turned to Rosie. "You be good for your mama, little bird." He walked back out onto the porch, his back straight, and surrendered himself to the deputies. Eliza watched through the window, tears streaming down her face, as they rode away with him, a lone, proud figure between the two lawmen. For a moment, she was paralyzed by grief and fear, but Jack's words echoed in her mind. "You save this house." She looked at the pouch of money on the table, then at Rosie's frightened face. The fear receded, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. She left Rosie with Silas, giving the old man a fierce hug. "Watch over her," she said. "Always, ma'am," he answered, his roomy eyes full of concern. Eliza saddled the fastest mare and tied the heavy pouch securely to the horn. She rode out of the yard not with desperation, but with a clear, unwavering purpose. She followed the creek, the familiar path a blur beneath the horse's hooves. She was so focused on her destination, on the tax office in town, that she did not notice the stillness in the willow grove until it was too late. They stepped out from behind the trees, blocking her path. Judd Baxter, a livid purple bruise on his jaw, sat on his fine bay stallion. Two of his men fanned out on either side of him. Baxter's smile was a predatory slash in his handsome face. "Well, well," he said, his voice dripping with condescending amusement. "Look what we have here, the little bride, all alone. I believe you have something that belongs to me." Eliza's blood ran cold. She pulled back on the reins, the mare dancing nervously. "This is ranch money, Mr. Baxter. It is going to pay our taxes." "Oh, I think not," he said with a lazy drawl. "You see, that ranch is as good as mine. Your husband is on his way to a jail cell. And you are going to give me that pouch. Consider it a reimbursement for my inconvenience." He nodded to one of his men, who began to move his horse forward, his hand reaching for her reins. Eliza's mind raced. There was nowhere to run. The creek was on one side, the thick willows on the other. She was trapped. Just as the man's hand closed on her bridle, a single, deafening gunshot cracked through the air. It was not aimed at anyone. A puff of dust erupted in the dirt a few feet from Baxter's horse. The animal reared, snorting in terror. "That is far enough," a familiar, gravelly voice called out. From a thicket on the far side of the creek, Silas stepped into view, a long-barreled rifle resting in the crook of his arm. Baxter cursed, fighting to control his horse. He spun around, his hand dropping to the pistol on his hip. But before he could draw, another sound reached them. The sound of dozens of horses, coming fast from the direction of town. A moment later, they burst into the clearing. It was an astonishing sight. Sheriff Morris was in the lead, but right beside him, riding tall, was Jack, and behind them was a posse of nearly 30 men. Eliza saw the determined faces of Thomas the blacksmith, the freight worker, the small rancher, and others she did not even know. It was the heart of Bitter Creek, the men who had been cowed into silence for so long, now riding with their heads held high. Baxter stared, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. "What is the meaning of this?" "Morris, I thought you had this man under arrest." "Things have changed," Baxter, the sheriff, said, his voice hard as iron. "We got a new witness, a young man named Pete Morrison. It seems he was so overcome with guilt, he decided to unburden himself. He gave me your ledgers, the real ones. The ones that show how you have been falsifying tax records and embezzling public funds for years. The ones that detail the sale of 2 stolen stallions and the payment you made to have a certain barn burned down. The color drained from Baxter's face. He was no longer a predator savoring his victory. He was a cornered animal. His eyes, wild with hate, darted from the sheriff to Jack, and then to Eliza. It all happened in a flash. With a desperate snarl, he drew his pistol, aiming it directly at her. Jack moved without thinking. He spurred his horse forward, placing himself directly between Eliza and Baxter's gun. In the same fluid motion, he drew his own pistol. 2 shots exploded almost as one, but Baxter's was wild, fired from a desperate rage. Jack's was calm, aimed, and true. A red stain blossomed on Baxter's shoulder, and he cried out, the gun tumbling from his nerveless fingers. His reign of terror was over. The deputies swarmed forward, dragging the wounded, cursing man from his horse. Sheriff Morris rode up to Jack and Eliza, his face grim but satisfied. "I am sorry for the deception, ma'am," he said to Eliza. "Pete came to me right after he left your place. We had to let Baxter think he was winning, let him make his move. It was the only way to catch him in the act." He looked at Jack. "You are a free man. All charges are dropped." Jack holstered his pistol, his eyes never leaving Eliza's face. He swung down from his horse and came to her, his hands reaching up to help her dismount. As her feet touched the ground, he pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly against him. The crowd of men watched in respectful silence as their quiet, steadfast neighbor held his wife, the woman whose courage had given them all the strength to finally fight back. The long siege was over. Lone Butte was safe. They were home. The ride back to Bitter Creek was nothing like the lonely, fearful journeys Eliza had taken before. This time, she rode beside Jack, not as a mail-order bride on probation, but as his wife, his partner, behind them. Judd Baxter and his 2 captured men were herded along by the sheriff's deputies, their heads bowed in sullen defeat, and behind them rode the posse, a strange and wonderful collection of blacksmiths, storekeepers, and small ranchers. Their faces grim, but their shoulders squared with a newfound sense of civic pride. They were no longer a scattered collection of individuals afraid of a bully. They were a community that had found its backbone. At the sheriff's office, the final pieces of Baxter's empire of fear crumbled into dust. Pete Morrison, his youthful face pale but resolute, was there to give his official statement. He had laid Baxter's private ledgers on the sheriff's desk, and the neatly written pages told a damning story of extortion, bribery, and systematic fraud. The scheme was more elaborate than anyone had imagined. Baxter had a contact inside the Territorial Land Office, a man who would conveniently lose the tax receipts of any rancher whose property Baxter coveted. The official notices of delinquency would follow, and Baxter would be there, ready to buy the land for pennies on the dollar before it ever went to public auction. The postmaster, a nervous, sweating man named Vernon Pratt, was implicated as the go-between, the one who intercepted and delayed mail to further Baxter's schemes. When a deputy was dispatched to the Mercantile, they found that his wife, Constance, had already packed a bag and vanished on the morning stage, leaving her husband to face the music alone. The reign of the Pratts, built on gossip and association with power, had evaporated as quickly as it had formed. Sheriff Morris, looking at Jack with an expression of weary respect, officially cleared the title to Lone Butte. "The land office will be sending a formal apology and corrected deeds," he said, shaking his head. "You will not be troubled by this again. Jack, you have my word." The news spread through the town like a cleansing fire. As Jack and Eliza stepped out of the sheriff's office into the late afternoon sun, they found the boardwalk was no longer a place of hostile whispers. Men who had previously avoided their gaze now met their eyes and gave slow, deliberate nods of respect. A woman Eliza had seen gossiping with Mrs. Pratt in the Mercantile hurried over, her face flushed with shame. "Mrs. Malloy," she stammered, twisting her apron in her hands. We "We are so sorry. We were wrong to listen to the talk. We are glad you are here." It was a clumsy, heartfelt apology, and it was echoed by others in the following days. The fear that Baxter had cultivated had been replaced by a collective, sheepish guilt. The town had been a silent accomplice to his tyranny, and now, in their own quiet, awkward ways, they sought to make amends. But the most powerful apology came not in words, but in the pounding of hammers. 3 days after Baxter was taken away in chains to the federal marshal, a procession of wagons appeared on the trail to Lone Butte. It was a small army of men, led by Thomas the blacksmith. They brought with them lumber, tools, and a quiet, unshakable determination. "A man cannot run a ranch without a barn," Thomas said to Jack, his words a simple statement of fact that carried the weight of a solemn oath. "We have come to help you rebuild." And so began the barn raising. It was a spectacle of communal redemption. The air, which had so recently been filled with the acrid stench of smoke and defeat, now rang with the rhythmic percussion of hammers on nails, the rasp of handsaws through fresh pine, and the cheerful shouts of men working together under a vast, cloudless Wyoming sky. Eliza, her heart so full it felt like it might burst, took on the role of quartermaster for this friendly army, with help from Miss Evelyn Reed and a few of the other townswomen who had come out to support their husbands. She turned the cabin kitchen into a bustling commissary. She baked dozens of loaves of bread in the now tamed cook stove, its heat a welcome, creative force. She brewed gallons of coffee and kept a huge pot of beef and vegetable stew simmering over the open fire in the yard. Rosie was in her element, a small, bright butterfly flitting between the groups of working men. She was no longer just the quiet girl from Boston. She was Rosie of Lone Butte, a fixture of the landscape. She carried buckets of water, her small face serious with the importance of her task. She sat with Silas on a pile of lumber, listening to his stories. She even earned a smile and a pat on the head from the stoic Thomas, who paused his work to accept a cup of lemonade from her small hands. Watching her daughter, so happy and so utterly at home, Eliza felt a wave of profound gratitude. This was what she had gambled everything for, not just a roof over their heads, but a community, a place where her daughter could run free and safe, surrounded by good people. In the middle of the second day of work, as the skeletal framework of the new barn reached toward the sky, Eliza stood on the porch, wiping her hands on her apron and watching the organized chaos. Jack, his shirt soaked with sweat, his face smudged with dirt, was working alongside the other men, lifting a heavy crossbeam into place. He caught her eye across the busy yard, and in the midst of all the noise and activity, a silent, perfect moment of communication passed between them. His look was full of a love and admiration so deep it took her breath away. She smiled back, a promise and a prayer all in one. The fire had taken their barn, but in its place, something far stronger and more valuable was being built. As the days shortened and the first chill of autumn began to creep into the night air, Eliza noticed a change in herself. A new kind of weariness settled deep in her bones, a feeling different from the physical exhaustion of ranch work. There were mornings when the smell of frying bacon made her stomach churn, and moments in the afternoon when a wave of dizziness would wash over her. At first, she dismissed it as the lingering stress of the past few months. But one evening, as she was mending one of Jack's shirts, she felt a strange, fluttering sensation low in her belly, a gentle tremor like the wings of a trapped bird. She sat perfectly still, her needle poised in midair. She laid her hand flat against her abdomen, waiting, and then she felt it again. A flicker of life. A slow, wondrous realization dawned on her, a joy so pure and fierce it felt like sunshine spreading through her veins, washed away all the weariness. She was pregnant. She did not tell Jack right away. She held the secret close for a few days, savoring it, a private, precious miracle. She watched him as he moved about the ranch, his quiet strength a constant, reassuring presence. She imagined his large, gentle hands holding their child. She imagined Rosie's delight at having a brother or a sister. This child was not conceived in desperation or fear, but in the quiet, tender love that had grown between them under the willows. This was a child of hope. She finally told him one evening, after Rosie was asleep. They were sitting on the porch, watching the stars begin to prick the deep velvet of the night sky. "Jack," she said softly, her heart beating a little faster, "there is something you should know." He turned to her, his profile strong and clear in the moonlight. "We are going to have a baby," she said. He did not speak for a long moment. He simply stared at her, his eyes searching her face. Then, a slow, deep emotion rose in his expression, an overwhelming tenderness that seemed to shake him to his very core. He reached out and gently laid his hand on her stomach, his touch reverent, as if he were touching something sacred. "A baby," he whispered, the words full of awe. He pulled her into his arms, not with the fierce passion of a lover, but with the profound, protective embrace of a husband and father. He held her for a long time, his cheek resting against the top of her head, and she could feel the deep, steady beat of his heart against her ear. The next day, Jack disappeared into his workshop for hours. When he emerged, he was carrying a piece of beautiful, pale cypress wood. He began to carve, day after day. In the quiet hours after the main work was done, he would sit on the porch, the wood in his lap, his knife moving with a slow, loving precision. He was not just carving wood. He was shaping a future. He was carving a cradle. One night, as they lay in bed, the sound of his steady breathing a comforting presence beside her. Eliza spoke into the darkness. "I have been thinking about a name," she said. "If it is a girl—" "What is it?" he asked, his voice thick with sleep. "May," she whispered. "For your sister, but with a second name, May Hope." He was silent for so long she thought he had fallen back asleep. When he finally spoke, his voice was choked with emotion. "May Hope," he repeated softly. "Memory and hope, it is perfect." He rolled over and took her in his arms, holding her close in the quiet darkness of their home. The ghosts of the past had not been banished, but they had been given their proper place. They were memories, honored and cherished, no longer powerful enough to cast shadows over the bright, blossoming future that was just beginning to take root in the rich soil of Lone Butte. Autumn arrived at Lone Butte not as a sudden event, but as a slow, golden tide. The days remained warm and bright, but the nights grew sharp with a crystalline chill, and the relentless blue of the summer sky softened to a gentler, paler hue. Along the creek, the cottonwoods and willows began their magnificent transformation, their leaves turning from green to brilliant shades of yellow and gold, shimmering in the breeze like a river of coins. The land itself seemed to take a long, deep breath, settling into a quiet period of rest before the coming winter. For Eliza, the season of harvest was mirrored within her own body. Her pregnancy had advanced into its final months, and her world had become a smaller, more intimate space defined by the growing life inside her. She moved more slowly, her steps measured, her heart filled with a placid, waiting contentment. The new barn, standing tall and proud where the old one had been a pile of ash, was a constant, reassuring symbol of their resilience. It was filled to the rafters with hay from the summer cutting, its sweet, clean scent a promise of security against the cold months ahead. The 2 stolen stallions had even been recovered, found sold at a distant auction and returned by a federal marshal, a final, satisfying postscript to Judd Baxter's downfall. The town of Bitter Creek, humbled and changed, had become a different place for them. The weekly trip for supplies was no longer an ordeal, but a pleasant outing. People greeted them with genuine warmth. Thomas the blacksmith would always have a piece of hard candy for Rosie, and Miss Evelyn Reed would stop to ask Eliza how she was feeling. Her prim face softened with sincere concern. The community, having found its courage, now offered its friendship, and the quiet acceptance was a balm to old wounds. One clear, crisp afternoon, when the golden leaves were at their peak. Eliza took Rosie by the hand and walked up the gentle slope of the hill behind the cabin. It was a place Jack had taken her once, a small, peaceful clearing surrounded by a handful of ancient cypress trees that whispered in the wind. There were 2 simple graves there, marked with weathered wooden crosses, Jack's parents, and beside them, a newer stone, a simple, beautiful piece of creek rock that Jack had carved himself. It read simply, "May Malloy, beloved sister." Eliza had brought a small bundle of late-blooming wildflowers, brilliant splashes of purple and blue against the browning grass. Rosie, her small face serious, watched as Eliza knelt and carefully arranged the flowers at the base of the stone. "Is this where Aunt May sleeps?" Rosie asked, her voice a small, curious whisper. "Yes, darling," Eliza said softly. "This is her resting place." Rosie reached out a small finger and traced the letters of May's name on the cool stone. She did not fully understand the permanence of death, but she understood love, and she could feel the deep well of it that surrounded this quiet spot. She had heard Jack's stories of his sister, of her kindness and her gentle strength, without being told. She seemed to understand that this woman she had never met was a foundational part of their family. She took the 2 little bluebells from the bunch and placed them carefully, one by one, just below the carved name. It was an act of pure, childish grace, a link between the past and the future, a tender acknowledgement of the life that had been and the new life that was to come. Watching her, Eliza felt a sense of peace so profound it was almost overwhelming. They were not running from ghosts. They were learning to live with them, to honor them, to weave their memory into the fabric of their own happiness. The first snow came early that year, not with a whisper, but with a sudden, silent roar. They woke one morning in late November to a world transformed. A thick, feathery blanket of white covered everything, muffling all sound, turning the valley into a pristine, untouched paradise. It was beautiful, but it was also isolating. The trail to town, and any chance of fetching the town's doctor, was completely impassable. It was that afternoon that the first pains began. They were low and gentle at first, a tightening in her back that she had been feeling for days. But now they had a rhythm, a purpose. She said nothing to Jack initially, not wanting to worry him. She went about her chores, her movements slow and deliberate, her mind calm. She had faced down armed men in public humiliation. She would not be undone by this. This was not a trial, but a culmination. By evening, the pains were stronger, closer together. She could no longer hide them. Jack found her leaning against the kitchen table, her eyes closed, breathing through a contraction. The look of helpless terror that flashed across his face was almost her undoing. This strong, capable man, who could face down a wolf or a gunman without flinching, was completely unnerved by the elemental power of childbirth. "It is time," she said, her voice a little breathless. "The baby is coming." For a moment, he was frozen. Then, the rancher, the man of action, took over. He banked the fire, his movements swift and efficient. He put a great pot of water on the stove to boil. He brought out the stack of clean linens she had prepared weeks ago. And he came to her side, his large hand finding hers, his grip a warm, steady anchor in the rising sea of her pain. The night was long. The world shrank to the 4 walls of their small bedroom, lit by the warm, flickering glow of an oil lamp. Outside, the snow continued to fall, a silent, swirling curtain that enclosed them in their own private universe. Rosie was asleep in her little bed, dreaming her innocent dreams. Silas, who had been caught at the ranch by the storm, sat a quiet, stoic vigil in the main room, a silent guardian at the gate. Jack never left her side. He was clumsy at first, his attempts to help awkward, but his presence was a constant, unwavering source of strength. He wiped her brow with a cool cloth. He held her hand so tightly she thought the bones might break. He murmured words of encouragement, his deep voice a soothing rumble against the rhythm of her pain. In the long hours of the night, Eliza saw him shed the last vestiges of the hard, walled-off man he had once been. There was no room for pride or fear, only a raw, open-hearted love and a desperate concern for her safety. He was her husband, her partner, in a way that went far beyond any contract or vow. Just before dawn, as the first pale gray light began to filter through the snow-caked window, their child was born. With one final, heroic effort, Eliza brought her into the world. The baby's first cry was a thin, furious wail that cut through the profound silence of the snowbound cabin, the most beautiful sound Eliza had ever heard. It was a girl, a tiny, perfect girl with a fuzz of dark hair and her father's solemn, watchful eyes. Jack took the baby, his large, calloused hands impossibly gentle as he wrapped her in a warm blanket. He looked down at the tiny, squirming bundle in his arms, and a look of such profound, wondering awe came over his face that it made Eliza's heart ache with love. He brought the baby to her, and she gathered her daughter to her breast, overcome with a wave of emotion so powerful it left her weak and trembling. "May hope," Jack whispered, his voice thick. He knelt by the bed and gently pushed a stray strand of hair back from Eliza's damp forehead. His eyes were shining with unshed tears. "You did it, Eliza. You are as strong as the mountains." She looked from her husband's beloved face to the tiny, perfect face of her daughter, and she knew in that moment that she had everything she had ever wanted in the world. The long, hard journey was over. She was home. The days that followed were a quiet, blessed dream. The snow stopped, and the sun came out, glittering on a world of pristine white. The cradle that Jack had so lovingly carved was brought out and placed by the fire, and May Hope slept in it, a tiny, peaceful miracle. Rosie was utterly enchanted with her new sister, spending hours just watching her, her small face a mask of solemn adoration. A week later, the trail to town was finally clear enough for visitors. Thomas the blacksmith and his wife arrived, along with Miss Evelyn Reed, bearing gifts of freshly baked bread, a warm, knitted blanket, and a small, carved wooden horse for Rosie. They stood around the cradle, their faces soft with wonder, their presence a quiet affirmation that this child was born not just into a family, but into a community that would cherish and protect her. One afternoon, as the low winter sun cast long, blue shadows across the snow, Eliza stood on the porch, wrapped in a thick wool shawl. Jack was beside her, holding the sleeping May Hope bundled against his chest. Rosie stood between them, her head resting sleepily on Eliza's shoulder, her small hand tucked securely in her mother's. Across the valley, the herd of horses, their coats thick and shaggy for the winter, galloped through the deep snow along the frozen creek bed, their breath pluming in the cold air. They ran with a wild, untamed freedom, their powerful bodies a testament to the enduring spirit of this land. Eliza looked at the scene before her, the sturdy cabin, the strong, new barn, the loyal, steadfast man beside her, the beloved daughter leaning against her, and the new life held so securely in her husband's arms. Lone Butte. It was not just a place on a map. It was not just a piece of property won in a fight. It was the place where her heart had finally found a safe harbor. It was a home, built not with wood and nails, but with courage, forgiveness, and the quiet, daily choice to love. It was a place where a woman, like a willow in the wind, could bend without breaking and rise again, stronger than before. Thank you for listening to our story tonight. We would love for you to comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please subscribe to my channel Wild West Night, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story in the video can be heard by more people.